Hey everybody, welcome to the Geordie and Josh show, another special edition. It's been a little while, Geordie, but we're back better than ever. New year. How are you doing today?
Good, good. Excited to talk about the best decade, right? It's the best decade because we were both born in it.
Yes.
Tina left Ike that decade. Abortion was legal. Abortion was more legal and more accessible than it is today. I think Diana Ross left Berry Gordy that decade as well. Rainbows were super in. Clothing was still pretty unisex before 18 at least. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about this great decade, which is, if
The
people haven't figured out, the 70s.
the 1970s, yes. Although I was born a few years earlier in the 70s than you were, but
Yeah, we have the 70s kind of squared off.
yes. And we're going to talk about the 70s and music and songs and what that period of time, what we remember and how it sort of shaped and framed our view of the world, our childhood. Anybody who's watched this podcast knows that we do a lot of reflection. We talk about what made us who we are today, the good things, the bad things, the stuff we've deliberately forgotten about. Maybe someday we'll do the one that we intentionally blocked out. We'll remember our repressed memories. But we're going to talk about the 70s. And I'll start off a little bit. But, obviously a lot of the songs that I heard, I didn't hear in the 70s because I would have been very young and I probably wouldn't remember. But they're the kind of songs I heard in the late 70s when I'm 5, 6 years old. And then the 80s when when my parents were playing them. And so it's stuff that is very much tied to very early childhood. So it's more than music. It's more than me deciding to stream a Alanis Morissette song and listen to the words a billion times. It's really blended and blurred into these memories of your mother and your father and your siblings and your house and everything that was going on at that time. There are certain Billy Joel songs I cannot listen to without thinking of being like 5 years old again or something like that. So part of I think what we're going to talk about today is what the songs mean to us, but also what they symbolize from that period of time in our lives. What do you remember about that period growing up, Geordie?
Well, so like you said, I'm just like a skosh younger than you. And so I don't, or I mean, I don't have any real musical memories of the 70s. I have like first primal memories of the 70s, and those are all repressed. So the music that my parents listened to, my parents had terrible taste in music. So my mother only listened to classical music. I think that she somehow thought that made her an intellectual if she just listened to classical music. But her one exception, her one like music with words was Billy Joel. So I grew up listening to a lot of Billy Joel. And then my dad listened to terrible, basically what you would hear in an elevator, like Muzak music, or anything that was in a movie about airplanes. So not the movie Airplane, but like The Right Stuff. Also, I think Chariots of Fire was kind of a big, but that might be the 80s. Yeah, right? Chariots of Fire.
That's like
That's
82 or
70s.
83 or something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So my engagement with 70s music comes later, and it comes in a very particular time in my life. So it comes in when I'm junior high, high school, experimenting with a lot of psychedelic drugs. And so my first introduction to,
Let's do a podcast on your first DMT experience. Make a note of that.
yeah, eighth grade. Call it eighth grade.
Okay.
Welcome to eighth grade.
I was
Yeah.
by myself in the library in eighth grade, but here we are.
I love the library. I was by myself a lot in the library too. It's a great place to get high. Sorry to give all the young people an idea, any ideas. All the young people who watch this. anyway, yeah. So I think my experience with 70s music is going to be a little bit different from yours. It's going to be a little more Led Zeppelin, a little more like I don't know, did you listen to Led Zeppelin at all? Was
No,
that
I'm very deficient. No Star Wars for me, no Led Zeppelin, no Pink Floyd, none of that drug stuff. Although,
drug stuff?
well, people who listen to Pink Floyd, never mind. But you know what I mean? That kind of music people zone out to. How about that?
Right. Well, I almost wore a Pink Floyd shirt, so I'm wearing a Blondie shirt, another favorite 70s band, but I almost wore Pink Floyd. But yeah, Pink Floyd The Wall.
Yeah.
Pink Floyd The Wall on acid. Pink Floyd The Wall watched with The Wizard of Oz. Do you know that you can time if you start The Wall where the lion roars in the movie The Wizard of Oz, the music matches the story? Have you ever done
Really?
that?
I mean, I've heard that. I've probably in one of my YouTube rabbit holes and conspiracy theory things you're looking into. I think I've heard that. So
Yeah.
what does that mean? The music is somehow
It synchronizes with the story so that yeah, it's kind of like there's something on Instagram right now. I might have sent it to you on private message where it's like Dirty Dancing, the last scene of Dirty Dancing, where they're dancing, it lines up with the introduction to the Muppets.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So it kind of does the same thing with The Wall and with The Wizard of Oz. Yeah. So, and then, okay, so that's so we'll talk about like my first introduction to 70s music, which is more like psychedelic, Yellow Submarine, stuff like that. Have you seen that movie?
No,
Yellow Submarine?
I have not.
Goodness. That's like an acid trip unto itself. But yeah, so, and it's the whole album, Yellow Submarine. And I don't know if you've noticed, but the Yellow Submarine is a metaphor for a joint, right?
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
No. I'm sort of drug deficient, to be honest. So definitely acid deficient. But that's what we all live in a yellow submarine, huh?
It's like a analogy for, and then the Yellow Submarine looks like a large joint, a fatty spliff.
So speaking of that, Puff the Magic Dragon, right? Is that about Puff a magic dragon, or is it about
I don't think that's what it's really about. I mean, it sounds like it. Like there's little Johnny Papers in it, right? So it's Puff the Magic Dragon, little Johnny Papers. So it just seems like it's so on the nose that it can't actually be.
Yeah.
But then maybe it is. I mean, Peter, Paul, and Mary, were they talking about Puff the Magic Dragon? What about HR Puffin stuff? Like
right. I remember that show. Yeah.
Well, that was like being on acid. Like that's like some psychedelic trip. The people who made that up, I think that was a Hanna-Barbera creation, had to have been either just at the end of their rope, like a lot of these things. Like I know this is later in the 80s with Alf. Remember Alf?
Oh, yeah.
But like so many different ideas that seem to come out of the 70s and 80s. Either people were at the very end of their rope with ideas, or they were just like high as a kite. And they're like, what sounds good? We'll have this big puppet looking sort of Muppet large monster thing. We'll call it HR Puffin stuff. And it'll be a kid's show. Like, anyway, so
I love when you impersonate how like an old man talks.
Well, that's my voice for most things. Okay. Like if one of my cats is going to talk or something, it suddenly sounds like, or if I have like an annoying student and I'm retelling a story later, even though they're like 19 years old, it's like, hey, Professor Armstrong. Anyway, so yeah, so later for me, later in life, post drug experimentation, I listened to 70s music in a different capacity. So we can also talk about that. But what about you? What are we both have Billy Joel in common.
Yeah, I kind of just remember songs that my parents listened to. So that would have been a lot of Elvis. I know most Elvis songs, every word, every lyric, and I've impersonated him as a small boy far more than I would choose to recall. Um, and my mother was sort of listening to a lot of Rod Stewart, Elton John, I guess kind of that pop stuff from the 70s, and Billy Joel and sort of that kind of stuff. So I have a lot of fond memories of those songs, because they're not, when they come on now, if I'm listening to K-Light or something, 101.7, and Tiny Dancer comes on, I can really get into it, because I'm a boy in the back seat of the green Buick, and my mother's smoking up a storm in the front, and we're singing that song, and so it means something along those lines. And so I think about those songs, and appreciating them differently as you're older. Like, when you're young and you hear your parents' music, you're kind of like, oh, this is so, like, what is this? And then later you grow up and you're like, damn, that Maggie May song, that's quite the story. And I think that's what I love about the 70s stuff, is there's a lot of storytelling in there. There's a lot of people's journey and their experiences, and a lot of it's based on love stories, but a lot of it is also based on sort of civil rights stuff, or a lot of the stories and political climate of the day. And so I really like that about that genre. Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin, obviously very aware of the groups, but I can't say that those bands were played in my house. They were more playing when I went to other people's homes, and they would put on those records, at that time. But if we could talk a little bit about Maggie May and Rod Stewart, who's still around. I mean, I don't know how old he is, but he's still there, and I guess making music. But I listened to Maggie May as an adult, and I thought, wow, this song's about something. And as a kid, I remember just thinking, this song sounds really good. I like it. I like the chorus. I like the guitar at the beginning, the drum beat all the way through, and it's like the suspense. And then as an adult, you're like, wow, what a great story of, I mean, I guess it's like somebody who went off to college, and they're supposed to be at school, but they got distracted with a relationship with somebody older, and it's this struggle of, what am I doing? I would need to leave, but I can't leave. I should be back in school. And then this back and forth of, maybe I'll do this and that and that. And then the end of the line, it's like George Michael's A Different Corner, where he says, something about, what if we had never met? Would you feel any? That's not the exact line, but in Maggie May, it's also, I wish I'd never seen your face again. And
Yeah.
I think it's sort of like this weird, hopeless optimism at the end of that song. But do you recall that song? Have you listened to that one a few times?
Yeah, so that's probably my favorite Rod Stewart song. And the line in George Michael's Different Corner is, turn a different corner and we never would have met.
Right.
And then Maggie May is I wish I'd never seen your face. Right. So both of those are, it's that, terrible feeling you have when you have heartbreak and loss, and it feels like it would be easier to have never met this person so that you don't have to go through this pain that you're going through now. And that would be common in a lot of different music stories, right? Is this point where you're in so much pain that you would rather forget everything than have to live through this loss. So Rod Stewart and Elton John and Billy Joel, you mentioned all three of those, and they're all interesting because they all get their start in the 70s, and their music in the 70s is very different than in the 80s. So like growing up, when I first became aware of music on my own, it was 80s Rod Stewart and 80s Elton John and 80s Billy Joel, and they were all cheesy AF, right? Like Rod Stewart had that kind of spiky, my economics teacher had that in high school too. Did you have that same economics teacher who had that same like Rod Stewart spiky hairstyle? You know who I'm talking about?
Well, no? Geordie, you know me. I never took economics. So.
We had to take it to graduate high school. Did you not graduate high school?
Not at Dos Pueblos. And if I did, I forgot.
Oh.
I'm sure I had some equivalency or something that I worked out.
Anyway, so Rod Stewart then was like, Downtown Train and
Forever
these,
Young, those cheesy songs.
yeah, yeah, super cheesy. Billy Joel stuff gets super cheesy. That's when he meets Christy Brinkley. How did Billy Billy Joel still meets these beautiful young women, and he continues to just look more and more toad-like as he gets older, right? Like he's shrinking, and eventually it'll just be like some 21-year-old model and this like full cane toad sitting next to her. But
I don't know
but
if you've noticed, but money and power makes people do
I
incredible.
guess, yeah, makes them ignore toadliness. So so that's when he does his ode to Christy Brinkley, Uptown Girl, and a bunch of other cheesy stuff.
There's
And
a few good songs on that Innocent Man album. I digress.
yeah, wait, what's on that album? I have that album.
For the longest time, Leave a Tender Moment Alone,
Those are
Uptown Girl.
so cheesy. Those are like,
Innocent Man is a great song, but go ahead.
yeah, just, I mean, okay.
But I
Agree
know
to
what you're
disagree.
saying. It is cheesy compared to
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah.
Well, it's the cheese. Like he's already cheese, and 80s Billy Joel is like the cheese. And same with Elton John. Elton John in the 70s is more psychedelic. It's more like he's really experimenting with a lot of stuff. He's got like his Tiny Dancer and his Benny and the Jets, and he's really coming into himself. And then in the 80s, it's just this I'm still standing 80s cheese. And I don't know what the 80s did to people, because even like the best of the best, like Stevie Wonder, who 70s Stevie Wonder is just some of the rawest, best music ever written. And then 80s Stevie Wonder it's still Stevie Wonder, but it's I Just Called to Say I Love You, it's like some synthetic.
Part-Time Lover. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I like that song. But yeah. um yeah, so I don't know what the 80s did to these musicians, because it took like the creme de la creme of musicians in the 70s and turned them into just the most synthetic keyboard, like get like a samba beat in the back with your Casio keyboard and just sing over it.
We could just blame Ronald Reagan. No, so.
Yeah, that and well, really, not to get, I was starting that with a joke, but to get a little bit deeper, I mean, the 80s, we made a lot of money. Well, the US made a lot of money and sold their soul. So maybe that's what's happening too, is that all those musicians made a lot of money in the 70s and then sold their soul in the 80s, and just became part of this money-making machine.
So here's the thing. Yes, Elton John, Billy Joel, Rod Stewart, they had their cheese years. But in the 70s, those songs were just kind of how I identified with spending time with my family. And so their songs were a little better. Billy Joel's for sure, Rod Stewart, Elton John, Rocket Man. I mean, these are songs you still hear like on the radio right now. Like when I hear Tiny Dancer today or Rocket Man, they play all the time on popular radio. But my mother, she passed away 20 years ago. So whenever I hear these songs, it's sort of a way to like go down memory lane and like I remember when we were singing that song. I remember when we were home. And I think to some degree, that's what music plays in my life still, that it's this ability to remember and escape and leave reality and just kind of get lost in those 4 minutes, 5 minutes. Maggie May's like her long song, but you kind of just go to that place in time and you kind of forget where everything is at. So I really like that. Do you have a favorite song from the 70s with Led Zeppelin or the Pink Floyd album, or what kind of songs do you go to when you want to hear that era?
Well, what's funny is I really don't like Led Zeppelin now. I think because I listened to Led Zeppelin a lot in junior high and high school, and now it's like there's a couple of songs like Going to California for Led Zeppelin is probably my favorite song, and I'll still listen to that. But so much of their stuff kind of reminds me of being in my teenage years, which weren't good years to begin with, and then yeah. So I would say Led Zeppelin, Going to California. But then Pink Floyd I still really like, and listen and Have the Wall, and my daughter likes The Wall now as well, which is cool. Um, and so Pink Floyd, favorite song from Pink Floyd. That's hard to say because one thing about the 70s in music is that people were really doing albums, like
Wow.
now and then in the 80s with singles, you could buy those single tapes if you remember, and with like radio edits. And I know there was radio edits in the 70s too, but like with the one song became more important, whereas in the 70s they were still really writing an album, which is like this full story, right? It's like a book instead of
Yeah.
kind of this one shot. Not that there's not albums today or standout songs even on these more these more storytelling albums, but so with Pink Floyd, The Wall is like this whole story, right? And is a rock opera. Is it a rock opera? Yeah, it's a rock opera. Have you seen it in real life?
No.
I've seen it a bunch of times. And then when I was in astronomy, when I was a student at City College, I was like 17. I took astronomy from Fred Marshak, who I later got to work with, but I digress. And we used to do this Griffith Park observatory field trip.
Yeah.
Now, astronomy still does that, which is great. But it used to be this all day where we'd go to Griffith Park, do the planetarium show, walk around, but then we would stay. And in the evening, they would do a laser show with The Wall.
Oh.
So I've also seen a laser show with The Wall with my astronomy class and Fred Marshak in the 90s. That was fantastic. But so I would say just the entire The Wall for Pink Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But then with that music, like that kind of more psychedelic Beatles music, more, like I said, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, who else would be in there? All that music I kind of wrap up with being young and, I mean, younger than I am now, and dumb and hopeless and just kind of like spiraling without a whole lot of light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
And then at the end of my freshman year of high school, that's when I started going to City College, and I became like, I was like, oh, I can go to school and I'm going to go to college and all this good stuff. And that's when that like music genre kind of cuts off for me.
Yeah.
So for me, listening to like Yellow Submarine or some of the more psychedelic Beatles albums, like what else would be a psychedelic Beatles album? Sgt. Pepper's. Have you listened to that album? Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is on
I
that.
definitely know that song.
Yeah.
And
Which means LSD, right?
Yeah, LSD initials.
Yeah. All that stuff gets kind of like grouped into this sort of dark period of in my brain. So then when I'm like in my 20s and 30s, especially when I became a hipster, right? Like I needed something in my 30s to make me an interesting person. So I was like, oh, I know, I'll become a hipster, and started collecting records and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's when I started listening more to early Rod Stewart, early Billy Joel, like Rod Stewart. Like you said, Maggie May is it's this anthem, right? It's this long story about coming of age, and many people's coming of age stories is going to include a broken heart, and possibly a broken heart from like an older, wiser person, which is what's happening in Maggie May. But then Stay With Me is great too. Do you know that song Stay With Me by Rod Stewart? It's about him like hooking up with somebody who's kind of trashy, and he's like, and you're gonna stay with me now, but you need to get the hell out in the morning because I don't want to see you after tonight. And I know that doesn't sound like the most feminist of songs, but it speaks to this intrepid post-sexual revolution 70s relationship with sex and with relationships, where people before birth control and before we had access to birth control. So we had the birth control pill comes out in the 1960 or in 1960, but it wasn't actually legal for women to buy birth control then. They had to market it as something that regulated their period. And then it becomes legal in 1965, but only for married women. So birth control doesn't become legal for all women until 1972, right? So in 1972, you have people who don't have to worry as much about getting pregnant and can kind of mess around with sex and fool around with figuring out what they really want in life and not getting married at like 18, 19. And you see that reflected in songs like Stay With Me, or songs like Maggie May, or songs like what are some Billy Joel songs that speak to that?
I don't know. A lot of the Billy Joel songs I listen to today, and I'm just sort of like figure like I'm still trying to figure them out. He's got that song, I think it's called My Life, where he says, "Go ahead with your own life, but leave me alone." I don't know if he's singing to a parent. I don't know if he's singing to a spouse or a partner or like somebody who's trying to control him. That might be early 80s, might be late 70s, but
that's 70s. And I think he's speaking to a parent. Like, I always got the idea that he was leaving his house, his like childhood home,
right,
and moving out and going somewhere else. But yeah, you're right. It could be a spouse too, or a partner, some kind of partner.
Like an ex, like, hey, go ahead with your own life, leave me alone,
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
But those 70 songs, and then there's sort of that, like there's the Elvis stuff where it's like the worst, I guess you could say, of his music, because he's now kind of a caricature of himself, and he's about to die in 77, and which, by the way, Lisa Marie Presley, recently passing away, and that's very sad. Can you imagine being the child of Elvis Presley? I mean, it's just like, how do you even do that?
Yeah.
The pressure that is there.
It's like being the child of Michael Jackson, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Or
So maybe we're better off, Geordie, because we're like on the total other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, well, Elvis in the 70s, that's when he starts his Vegas show. So he starts his Vegas show in like 73, somewhere around then, and works in Vegas, just in Vegas, and like kind of starts that whole what's now commonplace in Vegas, which are people who have like instead of going on tour, they have like a regular show. So that's, like you said, he becomes a caricature because basically he's just selling the cheese of being Elvis, the overdone, over accessorized. And that's when he starts really kind of sinking in. I mean, I think he'd always done a lot of drugs, but like sinking into the really negative, like uppers, downers, so he could sleep. And I mean, how old was he when he died? He was younger than both of us put together.
Like 42 or put together. I would say he was like 42 or something.
Yeah, he was very young, and yeah. So 70s Elvis is more of the cheese, as opposed to those other up and comers who were more in like their element and then sold their souls in the 80s.
Hey, let me ask you a question, Geordie, because it's a little bit relevant with that big Elvis movie that was a big hit and won an award. And here we're in 2023, and everyone has opinions on everything everybody does, and often negative. But I always grew up with this sense that Elvis was brilliant, genius, incredible performer, incredible voice, charisma, all these great things. We know he didn't write his music. He did a lot of covers, and people wrote songs for him. But his instrument was his voice and his ability to sing songs like no one else. But there's always people who say that he appropriated Black music, and that he made a lot of money off the songs written by other people who sang just as well as him but never got famous. And it's sort of like Eminem or something like that. Eminem being one of the maybe, along with Tupac, like the best rappers of all time. But there are people who say, well, if he were not white, we wouldn't even know who he is, kind of thing. But it's not really true, because he was rapping about different experiences than the other rappers were at the time. But what do you think of Elvis? I mean, do you think he appropriated and therefore we should look at him differently in history, or get over it? He's a great performer, and that's just, what he did with music at that time.
Yeah, and I'm really the authority on this subject as a white woman with red hair who was born in the late 70s. But so
well, we're going to amplify your voice and center your opinion, and make sure that we uplift whatever you say. So go for it.
And we'll keep in mind that I understand my position of privilege and all of that good stuff. But I would say that, first of all, I really like Elvis. And I've liked Elvis. Maybe Elvis was one of the musicians that my dad listened to. And, another musician I want to talk about in a minute is Neil Diamond, and who's like the Jewish Elvis, right? Ooh, I can give you my opinions on Neil Diamond, no problem. Box check there. But Elvis, especially his like 50s and 60s music before he's not really writing that much new music in the 70s because he's doing that show, but he's great. And part of the reason he's great is because part of the reason that people were so like blown away by him is he was performing a type of music that had been around for much longer than he'd been around. But it was also music that he'd grown up with. So he's poor, he's from Mississippi. He had grown up playing and singing and et cetera, all this kind of music. I think the problem that we tend to glom onto the figurehead, right? We tend to look at like, oh, Elvis was appropriating music, he's this white man, and et cetera, et cetera. But what we should look at is why did society ignore all these other musicians who were singing the same kind of music, but then Elvis comes along and they're like, oh, that's somebody that we can package and sell to the general population. So we put a lot of blame on the individual, as opposed to there's something very wrong with a society that will ignore music, take advantage of these musicians. So many musicians who would have been doing music like Elvis, I mean, they would have been paid for the day, right? Like their day in the studio. They didn't get royalties from music. They didn't get royalties from if Elvis or somebody else sang it or copied it later. What we should be looking at is why we as a society grab onto certain people because they're more palatable. I mean, this is a different example, but still kind of similar. So, Harry Styles. Mm-hmm. Right. And I love Harry Styles. I love that Harry Styles is like playing around with gender, which is what I have said a lot of times. I wish that we could just play around with gender. And you want to paint your nails, wear a necklace, whatever. We should be able to do those kinds of things. But so Harry Styles is on the cover of Vogue, maybe last year, maybe a year before. And he's wearing pearls and he's wearing like both masculine and feminine clothing. And people are like, he's such a hero. But Billy Porter, if you know who Billy Porter is an actor, was on Pose, wrote a book last year, maybe, about his life, is a singer, was in Kinky Boots for its first run. He wore a dress to, I think it was the Oscars. It was some big award show. Maybe it was the Grammys, maybe it was the Emmys. I don't know. He wore like this, and it looked like a suit kind of at the top, and then it like flared out into this big ball gown. And so that was a couple years before Harry Styles, right? And here he is doing the same thing, playing around with gender, flaunting the idea that he has to fit into a very normative presentation if he's male versus female. But he got crapped on like crazy, of course. And so this whole Harry Styles is so brave. No, I'm sorry, Billy Porter was brave, right? Harry Styles is allowed to do that kind of stuff because he has more money, because people know him from here to wherever in the world. And we look at that and we're disarmed by it, right? We see Harry Styles and it's like, oh, maybe we can play with gender. But Billy Porter does that and people are like, oh my goodness, you can't do that. You like that's still in a threatening package. Mm-hmm. So it's the same thing. It's two different men who identify as men playing around with what they can wear and what's appropriate to wear. But society looks at one and rejects one and looks at the other and they're like, maybe it's not so bad. Right. So when we're looking at Elvis, the story and the discussion shouldn't be about what Elvis did. Elvis was a poor man from Mississippi who was making money. Right. And he took his family with him, by the way. He took like everybody around him with him on tour. He employed all of them. He was doing right by his community, by his like personal community. But the discussion should be, why was Elvis the one that we all accepted instead of every other musician who didn't look like him, who sang music similar to him? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are good points. And he's also, the bottom line is he was talented. It isn't as though they put some guy who looked good and tried to make him something, because that never works. That only lasts so long. He was talented, so notwithstanding all the other things. But I just let's talk about Neil Diamond first, because it sounds like you've got something to say about Neil Diamond. Sweet Caroline obviously is an iconic song, and just about everyone knows it.
I drove when I was in grad school. We had to do like field study out in the middle of nowhere, and I drove one group of people crazy for 5 days singing that song repeatedly. So yeah. Well, so Neil Diamond, that's another one of the musicians that my dad would have listened to, and he would have listened to like the cheesiest of cheese when it comes to Neil Diamond, like what is that jazz singer, that album.
Yeah.
So I grew up kind of thinking like, oh, Neil Diamond is like cheesy, terrible elevator music, because I associated it with my dad. But then I started listening to him, I don't know, like I said, when I got into my hipster, when I first started embracing being a hipster, early 30s. And he is just amazing. Like he's so, especially his early work, he's so folky. He's still around, is an amazing songwriter, right? Like he spoke to, and I think like Elvis, one of the reasons maybe he's called the Jewish Elvis is he's able to speak to a more general group of people. You know what I mean? Like he's not speaking specifically to the stoners or to the skaters or to the surfers, like the Beach Boys were all about, like California surfing lifestyle. He was able to kind of like reach a broader range of people, which is the sign of a very, very good writer, somebody who can write and a lot of different people can hear themselves in it, whether it's a song or a book or whatever. Mm-hmm. So like Red Red Wine, or which, I was first introduced to with UB40, who
I didn't even know he sang that. I thought UB40.
Yeah, that's his song.
Is it better than UB40's? I hate them.
Much better. Yeah. So that and Play Me and why am I blanking on all the songs right now?
What's that They Come Into America song?
That's from the Jazz Singer.
All right.
And that's kind of like later cheesy stuff.
Yeah, that's a good song.
Yeah.
It's a good car trip road song for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So I came to know Neil Diamond much later in life, and I was able to disassociate him with my dad and associate him as like this really just fantastic folksy songwriter who, especially early on in his career, was kind of an every man, right? And every person, somebody who could speak to a lot of different audiences and people could identify themselves in his music. And he's still going strong, unlike the other artists.
Neil Diamond can't be his real name, can it be? Do you know?
I mean, it could be, but I don't know if it is.
Diamond.
Yeah.
So, the origin of this podcast started with you and I having coffee, and you were wearing Sonny and Cher shirt. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Let's go back to there. I love Cher.
Yeah. I love Cher.
That 70s stuff is so different, when she's very young and she's on a horse and she's got like a Native American sort of theme. And then obviously she gets really big in the 80s as a solo artist. But there's that time when it's Sonny and Cher, and that they're part of the 70s lexicon, pop culture. What's your take on those two? What do you remember about them?
Well, I love Cher, of course, like any good person should love Cher. And I love the Sonny and Cher relationship. So she gave his eulogy. He died, unfortunately, in a skiing accident. And by the way, every time I ski now, I'm thinking like, I don't want to run into a tree like Sonny Bono. But she gave his eulogy, right? Long after they weren't together anymore. He was remarried. He was in Congress, right? He was a member of Congress. So he'd been mayor of Palm Springs, and then he was in Congress. And her eulogy spoke to how he saw something in her. Where's she from? Brooklyn or Queens? She's from somewhere, one of those outer boroughs. And how she was just this like funky looking, tall, skinny, large nosed woman who nobody saw anything in, and he saw something in her. And you can tell if you watch that show and watch them interact, and they still do that show even after they're no longer together romantically. Mm-hmm. He looks at her and gazes at her with such admiration. Like he saw what the rest of the world needed to see. Like I said, Cher, she's not an everyman in the sense that like what I was just describing with Neil Diamond, but who doesn't love Cher? Cher appeals to so many different people like throughout the world as this glamorous, iconic figure, somebody that we can look up to and kind of idolize for so many different reasons. And then she's this great actress too. She wins the Oscar in what's it called? Not Moondance. That's a Van Morrison song.
Moonstruck.
Moonstruck, yeah. And then Mask. Do you remember that movie, Mask?
Oh my God, that movie traumatized me. I was so sad when I saw that movie. I didn't know that was that somebody had to have that condition. It was so sad.
Yeah. And then he comes to school here. Devereaux is the school he goes to in that movie.
Oh,
So Mask is a movie about a person who's born with this particular deformity, and he's going to die, and his mother is Cher, and she's like this motorcycle gang woman,
like Aaron Brockovich or something.
Yeah, like Aaron Brockovich meets Katie Sagal in Sons of Anarchy. And he's got this weird deformity though, and he gets really bad headaches. And sorry, spoiler alert, but the movie's like 45 years old. He dies at the end, and she comes into his bedroom and she sees him, and she goes and sits next to him, and so anyway, part of that movie, he goes to a school for people with special needs, and it's Devereaux, which is here in Santa Barbara. Mm-hmm. And he was a real person, and that was a real story.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Cher is this great actress as well, plus this flamboyant singer, plus I know not that many people are excited by fashion, but she was so daring with fashion. Like she was out there in her, what was that outfit she wore, which was basically like one big nylon stocking that just had like two strips that went like both boobs, and genitalia area was covered. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't think I've seen that one.
I think she wore it in If I Could Turn Back Time, in that video.
Oh, okay. I've seen that video. Oh yeah. Yeah, she had that stuff in the 70s, the 80s, and then Believe, was that 90s or that was the 2000s? Yeah, and then still
Believe is 90s, yeah.
Yeah.
Her gay anthem of the 90s. As opposed to Turn Back Time, which is her gay anthem of the 80s. So Sonny saw, something that nobody else saw but everybody else eventually saw, if that makes sense. So he sees this skinny, funny looking woman, and he's like, this woman has talent, and just gives her a platform and makes sure that the world knows her. And then the whole world is like, oh, you're right. Like, this is something we needed. Can you imagine a world without Cher? I don't want to imagine a world without Cher. I don't want to imagine a world where Sonny Bono saw this woman and was like, next. So yeah, so Sonny and Cher doing their show, like you watch him and he just has such admiration for her, even after they're not together, like even after they're no longer romantically involved. He's just like so clearly in love with this person because she is that fantastic. Yeah.
I can't imagine a world without Cher, because then I would never have heard Adam Lambert sing Believe a cappella. And if you haven't heard that, you need to listen to
that, yeah.
That is incredible. Cher's in the audience. It's like a tribute to Cher, and
Nice.
she starts crying, because it's so good. And also, if we could blend multiple podcasts here, Geordie, one of the greatest skits in the Golden Girls was when Sophia
Sophia and Dorothy do the Cher.
Right. And B. Arthur, Dorothy does Cher. Oh my goodness. The whole lip thing, and the mannerism. So yeah, we would never have had that Golden Girls episode. So of course I can't imagine a world without Cher, for sure. I wonder if like in 40 years, people will be doing podcasts and talking about like, do you remember Lady Gaga and how influential she was in the 90s, or not 90s, but 2000s?
I'm sure they will, if we're still here.
Maybe we'll be doing it.
If gorillas haven't taken over the earth, maybe they're on their podcasts.
Are they real gorillas or AI gorillas?
No, they're Planet of the Apes. It's Planet of the Apes.
Oh, yeah. Life. That's right. They should be returning on their spaceship anytime now. Cornelius and Zira. Okay. So yeah, Sonny and Cher and that whole I Got You Babe song. And like, if you Google on YouTube, you can find their performances on these late night shows where they do that. And that is the one thing about Sonny, is he's like, when you looked at her, you knew that was true love. Like, it wasn't lust. It wasn't like sexual. It was like he just loved this person's being and energy. And
and not to interrupt, sorry, but what's great about that is that she wasn't a cookie cutter woman, right? Like, that show starts in the early 70s. The expectation that women still fit a very, very particular look, way of presenting themselves, all that kind of stuff. Like, he shines light on this woman who doesn't fit into this standard of what people are supposed to like when it comes to women. And that's part of what's so great about that show as well, and elevating her and showing Cher, is that here is a woman who was unique, and instead of being told you need to change that because that uniqueness, well, it's special, but it doesn't conform to social standards of what a woman's supposed to be, he's like, this is fantastic. Like, more women should be able to express themselves, be themselves, rather than conform to some very confined box of what women should be.
Absolutely. Before we should wrap up soon, but are there any songs to you that we haven't talked about that mean something to you, that you really enjoy? I don't know if you've heard Bad Leroy Brown by Jim Croce.
Yeah.
That song that's a 3.5 minute song, and it's simple, but it's a little story about the baddest man in town, and don't mess with him. And all the women love him and all the dudes fear him. And then one dude Leroy Brown tries to mess with this guy's wife or girlfriend. And, even Leroy Brown meets his demise, after that. But it's such a good storytelling, and it's Jim Croce, and it's like this steady beat. And it's a lesson. It's a metaphor that, like, no matter how big and bad you think you are, you can always fall. Somebody will also always be able to bring you down if you're not humble about it or careful. And that's kind of what I got out of that song. It's just like, he's the baddest man in town, but he messed with the wrong woman, and he's not bad. And he got stabbed in the end, so, and I think it's ambiguous how badly injured he is.
Right. Well, that whole album, that whole Jim Croce album, I love.
Mm.
And he died kind of tragically in a plane accident soon after he wrote that album. And one thing I've thought from that album is how like much more we would have gotten out of him. You know what I mean? Like that album is, I think, the last one he releases before he dies. And it's just, it has Time in a Bottle, it has Operator on it,
Yeah.
it has one of my favorite songs by him is what's it called? It's on that anyway. Hey Tomorrow. I really like that song. Hey Tomorrow is on that album. Anyway, that whole album tells this kind of story of, it's not as clear of a story as, let's say, the Beatles Rubber Soul or other albums, but it's the story of like love and loss. And there's all these different songs on it that are about some kind of love and some kind of loss, and whether it's like messing around with the wrong person and getting messed up because of it, or whether it's losing out on somebody because you weren't like Operator, he's calling somebody and he wants to get in touch with this woman and she's living with his old ex-best friend, so like she's left him for somebody who was better, clearly. But all those songs on that album are about some kind of love and some kind of loss, and each one of them tells that sort of story.
Yeah.
And that's what a lot of 70s music was, it was because people were able to experiment more, because they had more freedom, because birth control was a thing, people had more freedom. And that means men too. A lot of people think that when women are oppressed or when women don't have access to birth control, men are just out there running around living a free life. But if over half the population is oppressed in some way, the rest is oppressed as well. That's why we oppress over half the population. But anyway, so that freedom for women to experiment more meant that men were experimenting more as well. And it wasn't just with sex. I mean, they're experimenting with sex, but you're also able, because you're not like getting married and getting tied down to a baby in your teenage years as much, you are able to experiment more with what you want to do with your life, what kind of careers you want to have. And all of that, I think, reflects in that music that we see in the 70s, people kind of playing out different scenarios. This is what happened in this relationship. This is what happened when I went and lived here. I think that's why we get a lot of those kind of journey songs, not Journey, but like journey songs where
Not Steve Perry. No.
where we're traveling somewhere, like Bobby McGee, that's a traveling song. Tangled Up in Blue, which I think is late 60s, but still, that's a traveling song, right? Like that's Bob Dylan's song where he's like, I'm over here and then I'm over there and I ran into this woman here and then I ran into her over there. And it's a short synopsis of that song.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot more experimentation with storytelling because people were living different lives. They were living lives where they were able to experiment more as people because they had more freedoms. And so the moral of this story is birth control should be readily available to all of us. Otherwise, we are not able to explore as much and the music is not as good.
Come on, Geordie, just drive to a state where it's legal. That's what I read on, Fox.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think that
Fox News.
Did
you say you read that on Fox News?
Yeah, I made that up because I don't really read anything on Fox. But I can always count on you to turn a podcast about 70s music into something smart and important and worthy of a message at the end. So
with just a hint of genitalia. Always. Just a sprinkle of genitalia in there.
Yes. And no C words during this podcast.
Not this time. Not this time, but you wait.
We should just do one on the history of birth control and how it affects the music of our times. Oh, before we go, speaking of birth control and songs, Papa Don't Preach. So I was listening to that song by Madonna in the 80s, and I just like blowing my mind that she was actually like sending a message that's very different than I think a lot of people would expect Madonna to have. But she's keeping her baby. She's sort of, she's going to keep her boyfriend. Her boyfriend's going to stay. They're going to make it work. And I guess it's the 80s, but like that message just blows my mind. I mean, what do you think of that song? Is that
Yeah.
I mean, that was her that was very different, I would imagine, than a lot of people would expect from Madonna.
Yeah. Well, that song is great because she's addressing something head on that people didn't address in music, didn't address directly, right? They either covered it up, like, I mean, this is way before, obviously, I know that, but Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants. Have you ever read that story?
Yeah.
Well, so that's about an abortion, but nobody ever says abortion. Nobody ever, right? But it's just these two people talking, and you either figure out it's about an abortion, or you're like, that was a whole story about the hills looking like white elephants.
Just like
but
Puff, that magic dragon. Yeah.
So people had discussed things like having babies out of wedlock, having unplanned babies, whatever, having abortions possibly. But here she is talking very directly about it, and says it's so directly that, and I was young at the time, but I remember my friend Trinity was like, no, she's talking about her boyfriend. She's talking about Sean Penn, like the whole thing. She's like, no, she means baby, like her dad doesn't like Sean Penn, but she wants to get married to Sean Penn. Like, she was so direct about it that people thought it had to be a metaphor for something else, right? It had to be like an allegory for something else. But no, she was just talking about like, I'm pregnant and this is what we're going to do. And I know that the narrative of like, I'm pregnant and I'm keeping it doesn't seem like revolutionary or feminist to some people, but what is feminist and revolutionary about that is her being so direct and having agency. And that's the point of choice, right? The point of choice is that you have a choice, and that choice is yours to make, whether it's keeping your baby or not keeping your baby. Right. So that song was great because she is directly addressing this issue that has impacted, let's say, most women in the world. And then there's got to be some men in there as well who are going to be impacted by it. But that nobody talked about forever. It's like masturbation. Like, everybody does it. Nobody ever talks about it. People were having
Darling Nikki, all the time. Prince. Darling Nikki's a 70s song. Yes.
No, is it?
I think 70s? It's late 70s, the Prince, or is it early 80s?
I think it's early 80s.
That's a masturbation song, but
yeah. Well, so it's a great song because she's so direct in addressing this thing that so many people have had to deal with, but like you felt like you had to keep kind of under wraps and not talk about directly or not talk about openly. And her doing that, taking agency over this very big decision in her life. I mean, I don't know how many people that like needed to hear that, but I'm sure plenty of people needed to hear someone directly kind of taking this choice and making a very direct decision about it, as opposed to like Bruce Springsteen and The River. That's 70s, right?
Yeah. That's
one of my favorite songs ever. So that song is about, it's about his brother in real life. But it's, he sings it from his perspective, his point of view, but it's like him and Mary are going down by the river. She gets pregnant, they get married, he gets a union card, 19, and it's their life. And they're just kind of like, ugh, like, okay, we had a good time when we were like 17 years old, but now we're strapped into just this like life, and there's no real choice there. There's no real agency there. Papa Don't Preach was like, don't tell me what to do. Mm-hmm. I'm going to keep my baby,
And it sort of reinforced paternal role models. I mean, she went to her dad, I guess she was a Catholic family growing up, but anyway, that's 80s. We'll do the 80s music some other time beyond George Michael and Prince and Whitney Houston, which you've already done. Again, you turned it smart twice in a matter of like 6 minutes. So fantastic. But anyway, another great conversation. So thank you so much for your time. And we'll.
All right. Thank you.
Do it again soon.
I'm glad that we coordinated our shirts. We'll do that next time with blue.
Oh, the black and black?
Yeah.
There's a 50% chance I'm wearing black on any podcast. So that's true, because I have black shirts and a blue shirt. So.
It's like Johnny Cash. You're the Johnny Cash of podcasting.
Yes. Ever since the pandemic, all I wear are black t-shirts. So. All right. Thank you.
All right.